Congregation may be seated, and Jim, if you'd like to wind your way up to the pulpit. This year we're celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Lutheran Reformation, and we're celebrating it by periodically having stories of faith and hope woven in from members of our congregation and others who share the experience that they've had with God in their lives. When we think about Martin Luther, the interesting thing is he was this brilliant man, really fashioned us with a theology that blesses his church, but it began with a personal experience, and that was his own sense of sinfulness. And what that journey led him on was to take faith of the head and lead him through a struggle so that it then became faith of the heart and moved it downward. And as we have stories shared, and Jim's is a wonderful example, we wrestle with the things of God, and then God shows up in our daily life, and suddenly those connections are strengthened. So thank you very much, Jim. I think you're going to enjoy his message. It's wonderful.
Happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there. I have this cup my kids gave me about 10 or 15 years ago that maybe longer, that has a bunch of sayings that fathers like to hear. I used that this morning. My favorite is, "No, Dad, go ahead, you take the first shower, that way you'll have hot water." So church looks a little different from up here. I've been on a few stages in my life and stood at a few podiums, but this is a unique experience. I have a trick, though, if I get a little nervous. You probably all know the same trick. So right now I'm imagining you in your Christmas in July sweaters. For so many years, my relationship with God has simmered in the back burners of my mind. Some significant event might turn the heat up for a while. Sometimes that fire was on the verge of going out completely. But mostly God and I have had this amicable acquaintanceship, friendly but not so deep. But then not so very long ago, God arrived in a burst of truth and clarity for me, triggered by a memory of my mother, 2 9-year-old girls, a volleyball match, a Paul Simon song, and a softball tournament. So to explain that, I think I should back up a little. If we go back to the 1980s, my parents moved from Minnesota to San Antonio, which is where they lived out the remainder of their lives. First, my dad died about 15 years ago, and my mom about 6. My brothers and I have been scattered all over the country for decades. One lives in Portland, the other in St. Louis. Janelle and I started our married lives in Iowa, then back to Minnesota, then Wisconsin, then Nebraska, and finally here in Plano. That geography is important only in one kind of remarkable way, which is in spite of the distance between all of us, my parents really never missed a milestone event in a grandchild's life. Excuse me. Birthdays, graduations, recitals, concerts, playoff soccer games, art exhibits. If it was important to the child, it was important to the grandparents, and they were there. Not a phone call, not a card, but a physical appearance. They usually drove in spite of, or probably because of, the fact that my father was a career Air Force pilot, and I just don't think he was capable of sitting in the back of someone else's airplane. These were usually short visits, but sometimes they were in it for the long haul. When my sister-in-law became gravely ill after the birth of her special needs daughter, my parents took over the daily care of the baby and her 12-year-old brother for more than a year. And that physical presence at family events and when the family needed them continued with my mom until the end of her life. Just a few weeks before her death, she made a trip to Plano to celebrate Christmas and to meet her newest great-grandchild. Every new baby got a visit and a handmade quilt. So with that as a background, we fast forward a few years. Janelle and I now have grandchildren, and we're doing our best to maintain this same standard of care with our own. Managing this is made easier by our close proximity to most of the kids and by the convenience of direct nonstop flights between here and Seattle, But it also gets more complicated because we have words like divorce and shared custody, which alter the ground rules. If we move forward again, we come up to something that's a little more joyous, and that is that our son wants us to meet his friend, which we know at this point simply as Wisconsin girl. My relationship with my son's pretty good, I think, but in this particular matter, he has reverted back to his teenage communication patterns. "How's it going with Wisconsin girl?" I ask, to which he says, "Fine." Then he says, "Hey, can you come over on Saturday and help me with a project in my garage?" What little he does say, though, makes it clear that he's fond of her. And once we meet her, it takes no time at all for us to understand why. But still, he moves cautiously, and we understand that also. But when the time is right, they decide it's time for his daughters to meet her daughter. That goes well, which means that Janelle and I begin to spend time with all of them, watching the relationship between the adults and the children blossom. And then, in what seems like a blink of an eye, we're attending a wedding. And our little flock of princesses has grown by one more. We have our Preston Meadow summer intern, and then we have 2 9-year-olds, a 7-year-old, and an almost 7-year-old. And I'm told that that distinction is important. My house, my suits, my office, the inside of my car are nearly always sparkling now with laughter and also with the remnants of glitter from some art project or another. And that's where the Paul Simon song comes into this picture. The wedding reminds me of a line from one of his least known songs, but the one that happens to be my favorite. And that line is this: "You take 2 bodies and you twirl them into one. Their hearts and their bones, they won't come undone." My son and his new bride, though, must be finding it necessary to twirl at a pretty feverish pace because it's not 2 bodies, it's 5. And blending 2 families is hard work, not just for parents and for children, but for grandparents, step-parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins too. It's very easy to make judgments and decisions based on what is now only half of a story, to make comparisons between long-established customs and new ideas, to compare those joined by blood to those joined by marriage. Every step, every decision is new, and it's up for scrutiny and second-guessing. Long-established family dynamics have to be readjusted and reaccommodated. Anyone who's been through the process of meeting, watching, comparing, and accepting a sibling or a new in-law of any kind can relate to this. We're all twirling, but sometimes it feels like instead of twirling in a grand ballroom, maybe we're twirling in a minefield. And that finally brings me to the volleyball match and the softball tournament. We have 2 9-year-olds now, one of whom I met just a few minutes after her birth. The other I've known for a couple of years, and she's been in my family for 8 or 9 months now. They have 2 events, both on the same day, at conflicting times, and one is in Roanoke and one is in Denton. And everybody knows that's not exactly across the street from each other. So we did what grandparents do. Janelle went to cheer for Team Extreme on the volleyball court, and I went to watch the Warriors play softball. 3 separate times during the tournament, my new daughter-in-law thanked me for coming to the softball games, not in any lavish or gushy kind of way, just simple thank yous. And for a while, I felt good about the fact she appreciated the effort. But then immediately after, I just felt sad. I felt sad that she thought it could be any other way, that she thought maybe there was a choice to be made between the 2 children and their moment. Sad that maybe she and her daughter might think that one child might be grandfathered in, automatically part of the family, while the other one had to somehow earn her way. But then it struck me that they couldn't really know at this point how I saw my role. I know a little about their own family dynamics, but not a lot. But in general, I can suspect that it's easy for a single mother and child to feel like they're pretty alone sometimes. And that for the mother, it can feel like it's a battle just to have someone in their lives who will see her child in the way that she sees her. It's certainly clear to me that her immediate family is loving, but they also live several states away, and they don't have the luxury to come for visits any old time. So physical appearances are, by necessity, infrequent and short. The grandparents and other relatives on the father's side are, as near as I can tell, content to not watch so much from the sidelines. So when it comes to softball games and art fairs and special events at school, there really hasn't been for this child somebody who would just show up for no reason other than the part that she's part of a larger whole. My newest children can't yet understand that all of our hearts, all of our bones are being twirled into one that won't come undone. So, while I can't imagine not attending the softball tournament, they're not exactly sure what they had done to get me there. And that was my moment of clarity about my place, our place in God's world. The moment that I finally understood this in a way I can articulate. In the same way that my softball kids are children of mine, I'm a child of God. I was chosen as a child through baptism. They were chosen for Janelle and me through marriage. Although we're not joined by blood, they're still chosen. There's no competition, there's no initiation, there's nothing to earn. We won't come undone. We don't decide to love them because they've demonstrated they're worthy of love and attention. We accept they are offering us their hearts and their bones, and we accept that we show up for their shining moments and their moments of sorrow, their moments of joy, and their moments of anger. Being twirled into one sounds like a wonderful bit of magic, and it is, but it's only accomplished through action. We show up to cheer each other on and to offer support and guidance. We don't waver, we don't withhold, and sometimes we have to wait patiently while we simmer on the back burner. Love is something that we do, not something that we wait to feel. And that, I think, is the lesson that God's been sitting back and waiting for me to learn and understand. Doing Christ's work in God's world is, in simplest terms, about showing up and acting like a father. He has, by example, given us a blueprint. He's in my life whether I acknowledge him or not, whether I have earned it or not, whether I'm begging for guidance or letting him simmer on the back burner. He was there in the steadfast devotion of my parents. He was there to comfort me in their deaths. He was there as Janelle and I, and then our children, and their spouses, and their children have all been twirled into one. I understand now that God's presence holds our hearts and our bones. I believe that what he wishes now from me is that I start to expand my reach. If I'm a child of God, then you must be one too. And if we are, then who isn't? If we accept that we have the same Father, then you're my brother. If you ignore me, you're still my brother. If you deny me, I'm still your brother. I didn't pick you, but we're all chosen. What a simple idea, and yet so hard to put into actual practice. Families of all sizes are capable of some fascinating levels of dysfunction. And just watching the news for a few minutes shows us how horrible human beings can be to one another. My own statistics clearly predict that I'll make plenty of missteps, that although I now see what's expected of me, that I'll strike out on a regular basis or serve the ball straight into the net. But when I do, I don't have to worry about whether or not God will decide to skip a few games. He's chosen me, the earth is twirling, and we won't come undone. Happy Father's Day.
In just a few minutes, we're going to be professing our faith using the words of the Apostles' Creed, which begins, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. It's easy, I think, sometimes, because we know those words so well, to not stop and think about them. But this morning, as you've listened to Jim's story, what does his story tell you about the love that God has for you as one of God's beloved children, chosen, loved, and forgiven? It's a great story, and I love it because we've had 500 years of Lutheran doctrine, and for those 500 years of Lutheran doctrine, There have been all kinds of God stories that people have had within the context of their own lives. And it's good to pause and reflect and to think about what is your God story today? How has God been present for you? Thank you. I told you he was good, right? We continue with our service. Please rise for the hymn.